Also steak and bubblegum. And I'm also an avid bass fisherman. I'm from Santa Cruz, California, Watsonville. And I live on 4 ponds right around my house. We got Pinto Lake, we got Redmond, we have Blue Lake, we also have Kelly Lake. And 20 years ago, a friend of mine brought out a man's top water lure. It was a frog. And I never had any experience with any of those, but then once he caught 3 fish on him, I asked him for one, then he gave me one, and then we've been avid topwater fishermen ever since. And if any of you do bass fishing, you know that topwater fishing is probably the most exciting fishing there is because of the fact that you can see the lure, you can see the fish strike, and the anticipation of the lure on the water. It's all I like to do is topwater fish. And then through the years, we learned that a single-tailed rat, in my preference, always seemed to be a little better than a twin-tailed frog because the frog had a lot of stability in the rear with its twin tails. So we always used a single-tailed rat. And then the colors that we used over the years were a black and red that mimicked the black and red blackbird around the lake, and we used a gray and white rat that mimicked the gray finches that were around the lake. And then just being that MacGyver type of person that I am, I asked myself one day, why am I trying to make my rat look like a bird? Why don't I just go ahead and make a bird? And so that was the beginning of it. That was about 7, 8 years ago. And here I have a couple original prototypes of something that I had created in my shop. And this is almost, I get a kick out of it seeing it today, seeing how far it's come. But this is like a little man's rat. We glued some wings on it. This is the beginning of the bird. My friends, like I said, they gave me a hard time about that. Let me stand up here. They go, that thing's never going to work. And I said, well, I'm not done with it yet. So I kept tinkering. And then eventually, 3 years ago, I came up with a homemade bird. And I was using the man's super rattling rat body. And I had put some living rubber wings on there. And I was now out fishing all my buddies at all my ponds. They were still using their rats and frogs, and I was using this bird right here. And then after the day's fishing, I'd come home and I noticed my bird was missing. And my friend was chuckling because he stole my bird and it was tied on his rod. And he told me to go make another one. So I was always making these little homemade birds in my garage. And they were out fishing anything that I had on my wall. All my frogs, all my rats were sitting on the shelf. I wasn't even taking them to the lake anymore. And then it was a couple years ago when my buddy Dan, sitting right here, we're roofing contractors. He says, you know what, I'm sure you've had friends tell this to you before, that we need to invent something to become millionaires, right? Well, he said that to me one day when we were working up on a roof, because we're getting old, we're closing in on 50 now. He goes, we need to invent something, and we need to get rich. And I said, well, I got an invention. And he says, what do you got? I said, I got a bird fishing lure. He goes, what the heck is a bird fishing lure? Bass eat birds? I go, absolutely bass eat birds. Bass love birds. I mean, so the next day he came out with his video camera and we went out to Pinto Lake, California, and we just bombed them on this guy right here. And I actually caught the biggest sack of my entire life, 5 pounds, 22 pounds, 5 fish on this guy right here. So after 3 days after that, Dan got on the Google search and came back to me and said, you know, Sam, there's not a hollow body bird lure in the world. It's wide open. I got manufacturer for you. And let's go ahead and bring these things to market. And I've never bought a product to market before, and I always heard the American dream. I think that was the most neatest thing, is to be able to bring a product to market. And sure enough, last August, after numerous prototypes, we now have the bird lure, and our company is flipping the bird. All my buddies would, I'd say, what are you guys fishing with? And they'd say, oh, I'm flipping the bird, you know. So we had to make it a little bit G-rated. We couldn't use actually flipping the bird, because if you go to Google search, you type in flipping the bird, you get a bunch of people doing rude things with their middle finger. So our company is flipping the bird, as in throwing it into the trees where the birds live. And the benefits of this lure right here, which I'll get to in a minute, is once I explain it to you, you'll realize why it's such a fish catching lure and why my frogs and my rats have all been retired and they're sitting on the shelf collecting dust. For one thing, when it was time to get going and starting to invent the hollow body bird lure, I wanted to make it the best possible lure I could. My friends are relentless. They don't fish the bird because they're my friends. They fish it because it catches fish. And when I came up with my first couple prototypes, they told me it was junk. They told me it was snagging up. They told me it was sinking, and they went back to their rats. And not till the final product did they finally all start using the bird. And here in my box, I got some original prototypes where the center of gravity wasn't quite right. We tried, here's a couple. We used yarn for the wings. Somewhere we had wings glued. And then, once again, we got to the final part here, which I'll show you here. And back up a little bit. The theory of birds and bass fishing isn't new to us. People have been making bird lures for years. This is a hula popper that I had found. It's a red-winged, black-winged hula popper. It's about 25, 30 years old. There's an article in Fishing Affair where they have a picture of a muskie coming out of the water attacking a red-winged blackbird. That was a 1959 article. We got the creepy crawler here. This is also another 25-year-old lure where they painted it black or bird color. So the concept of bass and birds is not new, just that I don't understand why no one invented a bird lure that was actually practical to be thrown into the trees where the birds live. They've made thousands of colors of frogs, thousands of rats. If you go on an internet page, you see 35, 40 variations of a frog. I mean, it's like these top designers were so narrow-minded on the frog that all they could do is just keep reinventing the wheel, basically. And I was just extremely surprised that no one had taken that leap over to the bird, which, in my opinion, I think bass would rather eat a bird than eat a frog. I know we make poison darts out of frog slime, so they must have some hereditary type of defense mechanism from getting eaten all the time. But I'll find, I've had a guy at the San Joaquin Delta, when he takes his fish out of the live well, he sees a bunch of feathers floating in his live well. He never clued in on where these feathers were coming from. But the fish in the live well are coughing up bird feathers after they're caught. We've seen fish cough up shad, crawdads, and he's seeing feathers in his live well. And not till that I explained the bird to him, he finally realized where the bird was coming from, where these feathers were coming from. So, what I'd like to do today is do a technique on the bird. And what it is it's a hollow body lure. Is that me or the wind?
The wind.
Is that the wind doing that? We got 9 protrusions. And on the initial design of the bird, first thing I wanted it to do was not to sink. And I've done that. This lure will float all night long. It will not take on water. And the reason why it does that is that it sits totally flat in the water. There's no protrusions above the water line. This pocket of air above the 50-yard line, so to speak, traps all air. And as it sits there, it'll float. Unlike other topwater hollow baits that sit up at an angle, the air will sneak out the nipple of the bait as water comes in through the underside, and then after within 20 seconds, 30 seconds, I've seen them as much as 10 seconds, the bait's already sinking. This thing will not sink. It is a non-sinker. The only time you'll have to burp this lure during the day is when a fish will take it underwater and you miss the hook, you miss the setup. As it's floating back to the surface, it's like a turkey baster and it's actually sucking in water. So you may only have to burp this thing 1 or 2 times a day. It will not sink. Another thing is I wanted weedlessness. I want to be able to throw this thing into the trees, into the tules, and not snag up. Nothing's more frustrating than throwing your lure deep into the tules and then having it snag up, and then your beautiful cast is being wasted by your lure being snagged onto the tules. I've got indentations on the back of the lure that allow the tip of the hook to recess into the body that only become exposed when the lure is collapsed, which is very typical of hollow-bodied soft baits. 2, when I made these wings, I did not want these wings to go through and through the body. I didn't want to clutter where the hooking was. Some lures like the frogs, the leg will come in one side, go across the body, and come out the other side. And it's basically just one piece of leg that goes in and out the two different holes. These are individually tied with knots just inside the body to keep the hook area from being cluttered, to allow a better hookup ratio on the fish. And being that the hookup ratio was another thing that I really wanted to have, I wanted at least 60%. I believe I'm around 75% hookup ratio on the bird. The tail itself is not, we thought about putting the tail onto the hook shank itself, which we elected not to do, to not clutter the hook. If you notice, the tail is separate from the hook towards the rear of the bait. So each of these wings and the tail, there's 9 of them, and they're all individually tied to the lure, once again to increase the hookup ratio of the bird. So once that is done, you guys get a kind of little closer look out here. That's the bird. We got bird feet on there, some wings and the tail. So now to fish the bird, which is another benefit of it, is that this lure stays in the strike zone as long as you want it to stay in the strike zone. Unlike a frog, where the twin tails, they add stability to the rear of the bait, but frogs are great at porpoising forward. So usually when you're fishing a frog, you throw it into your spot, and immediately you're bringing the frog back to you through a series of porpoise action, and it's not staying in the strike zone very long. This lure here stays in the strike zone. One, it doesn't sink, it floats, and to get the profile, you don't need to actually move the bait. The wings on itself and the way they float will give the profile of the bird. So the way I fish it is you throw it into the structure deep. I don't know if you guys can get a visual on this or not. Is that hard to see right there? You guys got a visual on that? Now you see how the wings are coming out, creating the profile of the bird? So that's what you want right there. And then to work it, that's it. You play bird, you don't play frog. So if, let's say you got some real skinny shade, because bass love the shade, you throw it into the shade, and you let it float there, and you just give it, that's it. The bass will see the cast. It's their territory. They know something just landed right above them. And then as an angler, you just sit there, and they're coming up and checking it out. Look at that. I don't want to don't bite it. That's still got barbs on there. But that's how you flip the bird. So it stays in the strike zone forever. So instead of pulling it out of the strike zone and then having to repeat the cast, you can throw it in there. I mean, we were at the Delta, we had a cell phone call, and literally the bird was out there floating for over a minute, and by the time we hung up the cell phone and started reeling it in, it got bit. So the profile of the bait, being that it's in the structure, in the shade, is what separates this from any other hollow body topwater bait. Stays in the strike zone forever, especially that mid-morning. Yes, sir.
The rod's kind of short.
Oh, well, that's a good question. I recommend 2 types of rods when you fish the bird. Me, I'm on ponds. We are all sitting down in john boats. And the reason I use a 6-foot medium rod is I'm normally fishing down here close, and I'm throwing underneath tree branches. Did I go up and over? So that's why I'm using my rod, because I'm giving up a little bit of hook set for the accuracy of the cast. Now, if you guys are in bass boats and you're standing up like something like this and you're pitching between toolies, I would recommend like a 7-foot heavy. So I recommend, so what we call it is either you're going to use a stand-up rod or a sit-down rod.